Morning all. So ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to address a few words to you today. I'm very happy and equally honored. Today, I would like to speak about the dangers of the Islamization of Europe, how it manifests itself, the fact that we are already in the middle of a transformation process, and who or what is promoting this development, as well as about the incompatibility of Islam with our Western values and our culture. This is my first speech of this kind, which I'm giving in English, so I apologize for any grammatical or articulation lapses that might occur in advance. My speech is, of course, not a scientific treatise. It does not claim to be, but rather a report drawing on 4 years of work and experience for a member of the Interior Committee of the German Parliament. This brief overview of the current situation is based on facts and figures and on observations and interpretations of them following common sense. I do not claim to be right with all of my statements, and I leave it to every one of you to form your own opinion, and I actually would like you to even do so. But let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to declare that Europe never was and never will be a unitary state, a vision that haunts the fantasies of the officials of the European Union. The European nations always had their different interests, their different qualities and abilities, but these have made Europe what it was when it was at its peak. Peoples and nations will always and will every now and then have different views of things on political and social issues. There are nations in Europe who like each other and others who do not. What most countries currently like is, and which therefore makes them vulnerable to EU control without being aware of the far-reaching consequences, is to be lavishly supported with the money of the German taxpayer. Sorry, but I could not resist to make this little swipe at the many open hands in Europe. Well, there have always been national problems that had to be resolved most appropriately on a national level. From time to time, we Europeans also face problems that affect us collectively, and of course these issues can only be solved together. And one of these common problems is the increasing Islamization of our beloved continent. For many who have not dealt with Islam in detail, the first question that arises is whether Islam represents a religion or a form of government. Well, in fact, it's both, the former and the latter, which therefore makes it as outdated as the Middle Ages themselves. In addition to the many inventions, philosophical insights, and the musical and architectural achievements that arose from our bright minds of our European forefathers, it was precisely the Enlightenment and the secularization that played a central role in the development of Europe and also on Christian religion. The separation of religious dogmatism and state is an essential building block for democracy, for a democratic form of society. In a secular democracy, it is not religious-based beliefs, but the will of the electorate that the common good and the civic values such as freedom, equality, and solidarity that guide political actions. This and the European idea of always striving for higher goals paved the way for Europe from the Middle Ages to the modern times. The separation from religious faith precluded that which is individual and subjective from the European political life. Islam does not have that quality. There is no separation between what is personal and what are individual beliefs and the state. The Islamic State is based on outdated beliefs and imaginative interpretations of ancient texts, of which the origin is just as unclear as that of the so-called prophet himself. A free democratic society cannot thrive on such fragile foundations, and the way that Islam deals with critics and those who think differently speaks volumes. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is under threat. This threat shows itself as kind of a pincer movement from inside and outside. From within, through the left-wing liberal and globalist forces who want to turn the Europe of nation states into the United States of Europe, a multicultural unitary state that has neither values nor traditions and no longer any room for national identities. These anti-national forces want to grant the right to vote to everyone, up and including migrants, who of course will vote for those who have given them access to the promised windfall. With that strategic move, the left, the Greens, the liberals, and the pseudo-conservatives are trying to engrave in stone their claim to rule Germany for all eternity. That, ladies and gentlemen, would be every patriot's nightmare, whether in Germany, Great Britain, or Italy. From outside, we are threatened by the uncontrolled influx of immigration from Muslim countries who are not willing to integrate. Personally, I'm of the opinion that Islam and this current never-ending immigration represents the greatest threat to Europe that Europe faces. But I cannot avoid the thought that these threats have one and the same initiator. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we all agree that we're living in times in which everything is turned upside down that we once learned about right or wrong. According to the current view of our government and their accomplices, the media, our values, traditions, our national identity, and sovereignty are the work of the devil. According to them, our values, our principles, the principles or exclusive cause for hatred, agitation, racism, and discord. What a pile of nonsense, of course. Nevertheless, we currently have to live with this mainstream opinion, which does not mean that we also must accept it. The re-education of the Germans, first carried out by the Allies and then by the 1968 movement, the Frankfurt School, and an education system that cannot be more left-wing liberal and whose standards are being further and further reduced, created the breeding ground for a society that is willing to believe the biggest lies and the greatest nonsense. And while we are on the subject of lies and nonsense, let's look back briefly to the year 2018, and here especially 2015, I'm sorry, and here especially to the month of September. Tens of thousands of so-called refugees arrived in Italy, make their way to the promised land, Germany. At this time, there were already consultations between the head of the federal police and the Interior Minister, Lothar de Maizière, regarding to what extent the federal police should be used to stop this influx at the German border. The position of the federal police was clear. They were willing and able to stop these flows of refugees at the German border. During a conversation between the Chancellor and the Minister of the Interior, Merkel asked whether the flow of refugees could be stopped without producing unsightly images. Following consultations with the Interior Minister, the federal police could not guarantee this, and Mrs. Merkel then decided on the following: everyone gets to enter. This decision of Mrs. Merkel violated the German Asylum Procedure Act and European law, especially Dublin III. What were the consequences for breaching these laws? Well, the truth is, there were none at all. Where was the outcry from the other heads of states who should have defended themselves against Merkel's arbitrary actions? It never came, and that in itself puzzled me. For whenever Germany did something in the past without the approval of the other states, and this is what history has taught us, there was usually a loud outcry in Europe. But this time, there was only silence. This decision of the German Chancellor was clearly illegal, and it gave rise to the beginning of a wave of immigration of unimagined proportions. Since then, more than 2 million migrants have inundated Germany, and around 10,000 more are added every month. Most of them still come to Germany via European third countries, which is still a violation of the Dublin III agreement, which Merkel illegally suspended. Illegally, sorry. Meanwhile, what is our left, liberal, brainwashed society doing? Well, crowds cheer and applaud enthusiastically at train stations and chant slogans like "refugees welcome." It seemed astonishing at that point that just one day after the big welcome party, Newspapers and magazines already had refugee welcome posters and stickers and other merchandise ready for deployment. You could have got the feeling that someone knew something in advance. And to top the madness of, some women even offered themselves to poor traumatized refugees for sexual intercourse. I'm not kidding. Society is ruled by a completely wrong understanding of tolerance, which is, of course, shamelessly exploited by these migrants. I would like to make one thing very clear. 90% of these people are no refugees. They are purely economic migrants who came here in Europe and especially in Germany for financial gains. Claims? Thank you. Claims that they are escaping from war, terror, and persecution are purely a pretext. Even in Syria, the fighting has largely ceased and large parts of the country are pacified. But let's talk, or let's take a look at the so-called refugees. They are mostly male between 20 and 30 years of age, in good physical shape and well-fed, perfectly suited for military service. It is notable that such men flee and leave their families behind in a war zone. What does this say about the character of such men? Which German or British family man would abandon his wife and children in such a cowardly way? The answer is, of course, nobody. Most of the people who arrive here provide wrong places of origin, wrong names, and wrong age. The reason is that these migrants are trying to obtain a special status allowing them to remain as war refugees, but they intend to stay in Germany permanently. They want asylum, and if necessary, they will lie to get it. The fact that these people come here with precisely this fraudulent intent is proven by the fact that they lose, which is a synonym for throwing it away, their papers by which they could have proven their identity. But of course, these theoretical refugees manage to hold on to their smartphones and their expensive shoes, no doubt thanks to the personal intercession of the Prophet. Establishing their own identity seems to be less important here than being reachable by phone. Perhaps it might be permitted to note that this is more typically the behavior of criminals rather than of refugees. Although there are ways to precisely determine, as we already heard, determine the origin of these people through medical examinations, our government refrains from doing this because it would represent an encroachment on their human rights. Instead of having these migrants sent back to their home countries, as they should be, our left-wing international federal government comes up with a much more practical idea. Why send these people back when you could bring their entire clan here? Well, more than 2 million migrants in Germany are still far from enough to achieve the elite's goal of complete disintegration of a homogeneous German society. If you were to believe, however, that the family members to be reunited or to prove a family relationship to the migrant residing in Germany, then you would be mistaken. No proof of a family relationship is required. Anyone who claims to be acquainted with person X and can obtain a confirmation by person X shall receive a plane ticket to Germany. Now, we can all do the arithmetic together, assuming that 2 million migrants can apply for family reunification with 4, 5, 6, or more alleged family members. Well, I don't like this thought. Another indication that our migrant friends are not concerned with protection but with financial gain are the many cases of multiple identities. Migrants in Germany receive a financial support of 135 euros per month if they live in a reception center, and up to 432 euros per month if they have their own accommodation. The cost of clothing, food, accommodation, and their other needs are also covered by the state. The state even pays the cost for purchasing furniture to furnish their new apartments. Other people in the household also receive financial support according to the standards currently at force. Since the financial support these deserving individuals receive from the state, and therefore from the German taxpayer, does not meet their financial expectations, more and more creative individuals come up with the idea of registering in different places at the same time and receiving financial aid there as well. Collecting data on this abuse turns out to be extremely difficult, which naturally increases the possibility of fraud. Since multiple identities are often used, the filing of fingerprints would be an important aid to prevent this from happening. Nevertheless, the government and the left-wing liberal support groups see this as, again, a violation of human rights. Therefore, the investigation of fraudulent claims by the authorities becomes a relatively lengthy affair, of course. With regard to multiple identities, people have been identified who have registered up to 35 identities in different locations and thus received funds between 10,000 and 30,000 euros a month. Well, I call that a good payment. Anyway, every citizen who protests against this obvious madness is denounced a racist or a Nazi. It now appears that a witch hunt is on for people who have their own opinion and do not wish to participate in this pathological tolerance at any price orgy. Many Germans now feel that they are living in a climate of fear in which they are concerned about telling the wrong person their opinion and being branded for it. The right to freedom of expression in Germany now only applies if it conforms to the system and does not represent national interest. A survey in 2020 showed that only 20% of the population would be willing to express their political opinion to a stranger. This brings us actually back to the level of the communist East Germany. And to add to the latest survey by the Allensbach Institute from June 2021 shows that 55% of the population of Germany see freedom of expression at risk. This is the highest level since 1953. Nevertheless, the authorities and the systemic media continue to maintain that everything is fine, that we live in the best of times that Germany has ever experienced, and that Mrs. Merkel is the best chancellor who ever walked on German soil. Well then, and the band, of course, the band on board the good ship Germania continues to play happily, ignoring the approaching iceberg. Similarities with circumstances from the past are, of course, purely coincidental. Those who accuse us patriots of anti-democratic behavior are in fact the ones who pose the greatest threat to democracy itself. And they are the real enemies of our people. The corona crisis has also been used to further damage our democracy to its foundations. In the past year, the basic rights of Germans, which are enshrined in the Constitution and are even partially subjected to an eternity clause, have been restricted to an unprecedented degree to the Federal Republic or in the Federal Republic of Germany. For example, people are being deprived of their right to freedom of assembly and even the right to the integrity of their own home. The German authorities lock up their own population on account of a flu, while allowing around 10,000 untested migrants to cheerfully enter our country every month and demand asylum. One could be cynical, maybe, like Monty Python, and say, well, chaps, cheer up, look at the bright side of life. At least we will have the opportunity to get used to a new form of government, namely the caliphate and the Sharia law. But unfortunately, this irony is actually not that detached from reality. In Germany, there are already Muslim parallel societies in which Sharia law is applied and German law is ignored. Sharia judges are already being used to settle disputes between Muslims, since these matters apparently can no longer be resolved by a proper German court. Some German police officers no longer dare to enter these Sharia areas, and therefore they can no longer fulfill their constitutional duties. I am very sure that something similar is already happening in Great Britain's cities as well. Our values, our rule of law, our legal systems, which have developed over centuries, are disregarded, despised, and mocked by these people. The German legal system is theoretically a good instrument to maintain law and order in a state and to structure it in an exemplary manner. But this too is slowly being undermined from within. Aided by the left liberal governments and administrations, Muslims have been infiltrating the administrative structures for years. Strategic positions are being filled, and Muslims are also on duty in the police and in the German armed forces. In these positions, they have access not only to confidential and strategic informations, but also to weapons and military equipment. It has already happened several times that police raids against organized crime clans have failed because of information betrayal. If foreign rapists and murders can get away with suspended sentences or are declared incapable of guilt due to alleged war trauma after pushing a young mother with her son onto rails in front of an approaching train, and the son is fatally injured in the process, then, ladies and gentlemen, something is very wrong with our state. But let's pause here for a little second and consider how we arrived in this deplorable position in the first place. If we look at the first generation of Turkish guest workers in Germany who came to our country at the beginning of the 1960s, then you will see that these people still had respect for Germany and the German people. A not insignificant part of the second generation was brought up to respect Germany, and many decent citizens of Turkish origin emerged from this Turkish community. At the same time, there was no question about a German citizenship. Despite their Muslim beliefs, these individuals respected our democracy and our legal system. This has been almost totally reversed with the third generation. The Islamic scholar Ibrahim Raymond described this transformation in one of his lectures in the German parliament. His research convinced him that the representatives of the third generations tend to search for their roots, for their origin of their own culture and their identities as a full Muslim. One begins to place oneself above the unbelievers, despises the Occidental culture, and constructs new enemy images. From a sociological point of view, one can say that these people are trying to compensate for their own inability to assert themselves in this culture through competence and achievements. In this context, it can be clearly observed that people with a lower level of education are more quickly and more radically attached to these old beliefs. The less educated suddenly prefer Sharia law to the Western legal system, isolate themselves, and create parallel societies in a very short time. These parallel societies are mostly riddled with criminal structures. What are the factors influencing such a change? Well, first of all, the demographic development is a cause. The Muslims have multiplied far more than the Germans. The former Muslim minorities have grown into large groups, and it's precisely at this point that every Islamic scholar or enlightened and Western-oriented Muslim will confirm that a turning point will have been reached. The Muslims begin to claim the environment, the district in which they comprise the majority of the population, and they expect that others, even the indigenous local people, to adhere to the rules of the Muslims. The Western culture, our Western values, are rejected as wrong and as blasphemy. The earlier prudence is given way to a pronounced arrogance and self-love with a clear tendency to violence. Another reason why there is such a marked level of self-assertion is the Muslim well-organized propaganda machine, even outside of their ancestral habitat. In contrast to us Europeans, to us Christians, Muslims always agree on question of religion, at least as far as we unbelievers are concerned. The unbeliever is the enemy, and the enemy must be fought. Anyone who thinks I'm exaggerating should just take a look, or a closer look, at the thousands of propaganda centers in Germany or here in England, also known as mosques, and listen to the sermons. Oh yes, this could prove a bit difficult than expected, given to our status as unbelievers and our lack of language skills. The German author Christian Schreiber was able to gain access to the Muslim sermons because he speaks fluent Arabic. In his book Inside Islam, Schreiber provided very illuminating and at the same time terrifying insights in which, however, only gently scratched the surface of the whole miserable situation. A good friend of mine, a Lebanese, who has lived in Germany for more than 30 years, is highly critical of the Islam and who has also given many lectures in the parliament, confirmed to me just a few days ago that we only learn a maximum of 5% of what is actually going on in the German mosques. We already have 2,800 registered mosques in Germany. There are also prayer rooms, which, in contrast to the mosques, do not have to be registered. This means there is certainly a 3, if not a 4-digit number of prayer rooms in which there is no reliable information available on what is being propagated. One of the essential ideas that have percolated through the walls of the prayer rooms and mosques is that the Muslims should only adhere to our constitution as long as they are the minority. As soon as they become the majority, the Sharia law and the Sharia should become the only legislative basis for the Muslims. Our Western values and our Western culture will not only be rejected, but also abolished. Western women are declared fair game. They are called whores, and they are worthless in the eyes of a Muslim. In their sermons, the Muslims preachers try to completely block out the Western world. One speaks of camels and figs as the means of payment. All of this happens despite the fact that generations of Muslims in our country owe their relative prosperity and education actually to our Western system. I don't know about you, but under no circumstances do I want to live with such obvious racists and supporters of such a sick ideology. This is our Europe with our values and our traditions. And whoever does not adhere to them or does not want to adhere to them should leave Europe right away. There is no need for any discussion about this, actually, and this must be our clear and unified position. The level of what is bearable has long been passed. On the other hand, these individuals, the Muslims, they demand tolerance towards the Muslim minorities and declare Islam, of course, a religion of love and peace. But they are not ready to accept Western culture as far as they are concerned. So why should we show any tolerance, let alone Christian charity, to those who most persecute Christians all over the world? In spite of all this, the deadly argument of tolerance seems to prevail, and the transformation of society is tolerated and unnoticed by the simple-minded and indoctrinated public. And while we are on the subject of tolerance, let's talk about Muslims and human rights. If you, ladies and gentlemen, believe that as Christians you are entitled to human rights, then you are mistaken, at least if the Muslim preachers have a say in this connection. In this context, I would like to draw your valued attention to the Cairo Declaration of 1990, which clearly defines the Muslims' understanding of the application of human rights. This declaration clearly states that human rights only apply in conjunction with Sharia and only if these rights are also compatible with Sharia law. I would like to take up a few points briefly so that you could perceive the status assigned to you as a Christian, or should I rather say as an unbeliever. Article 24 of this Cairo Declaration states, for example, and I quote, "All rights and freedoms set out in this declaration are subordinate to Islamic Sharia. Article 19 points out there are no crimes and punishments other than those set out in Sharia law. The role of Islamic law as the sole source of justice is confirmed by Article 25 of this declaration, which is stipulating the following. Islamic Sharia is the sole reference for the interpretation of all articles in this declaration. The Cairo Declaration underscores its origin in Islam as the true religion and the way of life of Islamic society, which is described as the best of all human societies and which has a civilizing and historical role. In almost every reference to human rights, the Cairo Declaration prescribes that these rights must be exercised in accordance with Sharia law. Article 22, for example, limits the freedom of speech to expressions of opinion that do not contradict Islamic law. The right to exercise public office can only be exercised in the accordance with Sharia law. The Cairo Declaration is in complete contradiction of the international understanding of human rights. Of course, the irrevocability of religious freedom is not recognized either. In recent history, Islam has always proven that it can only rule through violence and fear and through the oppression, expulsion, and killing of those who think differently. We are not only talking about the bestial murders of the terror regime of the Islamic State, but also about the so-called normal Muslim states. Stoning is still carried out in many Muslim countries, as is the public hanging of people who have committed criminal offenses in accordance with Sharia law. We all remember, well, these ISIS videos in which their prisoners had their throat cut in front of the camera. Their offense? They were unbelievers. And early history is also full of such events which serve as an example for how far the Islam is from our Western culture and from our conception of the value of life. Nonetheless, through the already mentioned left liberal and globalist advocates, Islam receives support in suppressing opinions critical to the Islam, even in our very own society. It is well known that the radical Islamic states like Qatar or Saudi Arabia are courted by our politicians and receive financial support. How does this attitude actually relate to our responsibility for the integrity of Jewish life in Germany? Yes, indeed, people like Claudia Roth, who is an MP and the Vice President of the German Parliament, and Federal President Frank-Walter Steinmeier still owe us an explanation. For these, ladies and gentlemen, Islam is a religion of peace and love, as we already heard. Politicians like Roth and Steinmeier make a benevolent distinction between Islam and radical Islamism. Within this context, they have merely forgotten one insignificant detail. No such differentiation is made within the Islam. The word Islamism does not exist in the Islam. Islam is Islam, and that's it, full stop. Islam is the way it is, and probably nothing will change this radical, racist, and medieval outlook. Our politicians and their subservient press have come up with a fairy tale of radical Islamism to pretend that Islam does not pose a threat to our society. This is probably intended to deceive people up and beyond the point of no return. Nobody in management position can be that stupid and fail to recognize the facts that are exposed. Here, a deliberate illusion is being foisted onto the public. Ladies and gentlemen, you know perfectly well that no lecture can do without the part in which the listener, already tired and deprived of oxygen in the conference room, gets bombarded by numbers and statistics, which further promotes fatigue and oxygen deprivation. Well, my speech will be no exception. But I will try to be brief, at least. Our opponents like to claim that we wrongly assume that Muslims and migrants are far more criminal than native Europeans, and that we persist in this way of thinking only out of sheer malice, and that we cannot offer any corroborating evidence at all. Well, I would like to provide this corroborating evidence now and share with you a glimpse into the German crime statistics for 2020. But first of all, I would like to flag an important statistical fact. If you look at the German crime statistics, you have to know that a distinction is made between German suspects and non-German suspects, along with the proportion of immigrants. If you now know, however, that people with a migration background and German citizenship are listed under German suspects for criminal statistics, a non-clearly definable proportion of foreigners must always be deducted from the German suspects in order to maintain proportionality. Now let's take a closer look at some offenses. Let's start with the offense of murder, manslaughter, and homicide on demand. Proportion of foreign suspects in total 40.61%. Another example, dangerous and seriously body harm, proportion of foreign suspects 38.2%. Last but not least, rape and sexual assault. Proportion of foreigners is 37%. So now the total proportion of foreigners in Germany is 13.5. This ratio runs in a similar form through the entire crime statistics and clearly shows that foreigners have a higher level of violence and crime potential than the average European. In addition, we now have to deal with another category of crime which was brought to us almost exclusively by migrants and foreigners, namely so-called clan crimes. This problem has been neglected by the German judiciary for years. In the meantime, the criminal clans have taken over entire districts, and the police are faced with an impossible task with their means at their disposal. In 2020, around 600 proceedings were conducted against organized crime groups. The number of suspected immigrants in the area of organized crime groups have increased dramatically compared to the previous years. We had in 2019 505, and it increased to 890 suspects in 2020. The number of organized crime groups dominated by immigrants has also increased from 45 in 2019 to 85 in 2020. The following is a small breakdown of the organized crime groups controlled by immigrants by nationality and their main field of activity. So we have 16 Albanian-dominated crime groups, main activity, drug crimes, property crimes, smuggling. 8 Lebanese-dominated crime groups, main activity, drug crimes, smuggling, counterfeit crimes. 8 Turkish-dominated crime groups, main activity, drug crimes, crimes connected to economic life. 6 groups dominated by Kosovars, main activity, have a guess, drug crimes, crimes connected to economic life. And 5 Syrian-dominated organized crime groups, main activities, drug crimes, smuggling, and so on and so forth. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I will now spare you any further figures because I think I succeeded in showing you that foreigners, and especially from Muslim countries, do not only disapprove of our culture and traditions, but they are also disproportionately more criminal. Another problem that is completely underestimated and not adequately conveyed by the media are the IS returnees. Of course, these are almost exclusively Muslims. And dangerous are individuals who pose a threat to public life and security. And in connection with IS returnees, in particular, the clear ignorance of our rulers and the inactivity of our legal systems are becoming patently obvious. The most recent example consists 8 German women and their 23 children who were brought back last week, now it's almost 2 weeks, and who traveled to a conflict region in 2014 and 15 and joined the terrorist militia. There are arrest warrants for some of these women, but it's not known if and to what extent this will actually be enforced upon arrival. The fact is that radical Muslims are being brought back to Germany when it's not clear to what extent these people have been involved in murder, torture, or acts of war. The legal evidence against them is sometimes extremely difficult to establish. Some of the children were born in the war zones, and some of them were even deported from Germany to Syria against the wishes of their partners when they were very young. So these children have actually not received any Western civilization, socialization, but are indoctrinated to hatred and against us unbelievers. How do the responsible authorities imagine that these women and children will be reintegrated into our society? Aren't our officials risking innocent lives for the sake of a dubious sociological experiment? Should these women be allowed to return to Germany at all? I clearly say no. Who voluntarily joins? No. And those who voluntarily join a terrorist organization abroad have clearly forfeited their right to return to a civilized society, as you British did with some people who wanted to come back to Britain, I heard. As for the endangerers, the Federal Criminal Police Office refers to 596 endangerers in the latest figures as of February 1st, 2021. In the case of these persons, the police authorities assume that certain facts speak for the assumption that crimes will be committed at a large scale. And although it is obviously clear that these endangerers pose a danger, they are roaming free in our country. We have already had several causes in Germany in which people who were registered as dangerous actually committed a serious criminal offense. The worst example is still the attack on the Christmas market in Berlin in 2016 by Anis Amri, in which 11 people were killed and 55 more were seriously injured. This happened even though German security services classified this person as dangerous and had him under surveillance. In 2020, the newspapers published a report on so-called high-risk Islamists, alongside those who were at risk. 124 of them are at large in Germany. Although this is known to the authorities, the Federal Criminal Police Office does not consider it necessary to keep such person under full surveillance around the clock and cannot provide any information about the arms in possession of these people. Since the appearance of the aforementioned press article, this group of persons has not been mentioned in the media for over a year. As if this were not enough, we have to recall the words of the IS leaders a few years ago who announced in 2015 that at least one IS sleeper would be smuggled into Europe disguised as a refugee on every refugee boat. We can only speculate about the mass of undetected potential Islamist terrorists, but there are surely thousands of them. As I conclude my lecture, I am confronted with the sober realization that Islam has never been our friend, and based on the facts at hand, it does not want to become our friend either. This creed aims to displace our values and traditions from Europe in order to reshape our continent according to its ideas towards an Islamic society dominated by Muslims and the Sharia law. The completely inappropriate tolerance towards Islam and its openly racist outlook towards us Christians, but also towards all the other religions, must come to an end. We can only successfully oppose Islam if we put aside our little problems that affect our nations and stand united against the assimilation of our nations and our cultures. Europe, once defined as the only civilization by a prominent Muslim of the name of Kemal Atatürk, must reflect on its values, its qualities, and its former strength. We will not retreat in the face of Muslim pressure. We will defend our Europe against the Muslim invasion. We succeeded once before, and we will do it again. God save our Europe. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.